speaker. Get up here. He manages the Portland State University Herbarium, and he recently retired from PSU's Institute for Natural Resources, where he worked for 29 years as a geologist and a botanist. His interests include wetland and urban vegetation, mosses, botanical history, and historical ecology. He received a Bachelor in Science and General Science from the University of Oregon and a Master's in Botany from the University of British Columbia. And he's going to talk with us today about the GLO maps and what that can tell us about the historical ecology of our region. Thank you.
Thanks, Lindsay. Do we have a pointer?
We don't.
You don't?
We have
Okay.
fingers. I'm so sorry.
And then just advance with
Spacebar.
Spacebar. Okay. So Lindsay indicated this is a study based on the General Land Office survey notes, and it's otherwise known as the rectangular survey system or the public land survey. And those are the guys who laid out the township and range system. I'm sure all of you know this. It's the foundation for any kind of private land ownership. It's kind of been supplanted for anyone doing field work, supplanted by GPS units. But the township and range is still very much in play with real estate issues. And what we did, we had some funding from the Mount Hood National Forest. So this would cover primarily the gorge southward. We have not done any work on north of the Columbia River up into that Ellensburg area. But what I wanted to do is kind of show you the applicability, potential use of oak, representation of oak in this study area on the Hood. And you can see whether it might be useful further north. The rectangular survey system was developed in the 1790s and is basically applied from about Ohio westward. So the whole, 2/3 of the country was surveyed and pretty much under this exact same methodology. And it was defined with instructions, specific instructions for surveyors to use. And so it's a very consistent data set across the country. And they had to survey the townships first, 36 square miles, and then they would subdivide those into square mile sections. And they had to do that before they gave away any land or sold land. Like the land claims, for instance, donation land claims, they had to do the rectangular survey first. And in the Pacific Northwest, they were after farmland. It's the first area that got surveyed. And obviously, the lower elevation, more amenable soil types. And then within the same township, they may have gone back 40 years later and surveyed the uplands. They're up in the mountains. So there are some times where you get these gaps of 40 years where they've done a partial survey down low and finished it off later. And of course, General Land Office eventually became part of BLM, 1946. They combined it with the Grazing Service. And BLM maintains all the records in Portland. And the utility for ecologists is people first recognized the usefulness of these land survey notes in the Midwest in the 1920s and started doing studies then. And then they've been applied here and there across the country. One of the main uses is the fact that it was based on vegetation and of course other things like topography and rivers, but they had to drag these steel chains up and down across the valleys, and every half a mile they would mark either a quarter section corner or a section corner, and they had to have what they call witness trees, which they used to record the bearing and the distance from this tree to that corner. And so the vegetation was sort of the control point for these points on the ground. And along each section line, which was basically like a transect, you know, they had to record changes in vegetation as well. So enter prairie, leave prairie, enter burn, leave burn. So there's a lot of information in there. And at the end of each section line, they had to write a line description. So just maybe 3 sentences of what they'd been across. And they had to list the dominant trees and the dominant shrubs. And so your woody veg is pretty well represented. And even in the order in which it was listed indicates its abundance. So you've got these witness trees, you know what the species are in most cases, and you've got the information about the shrubs. They did not have to record herbaceous stuff. So you're lucky if you get information on that. And they have a few things they would mention, like camas or wapato, but it's generally pretty rare that, other than good grass. Grass, of course, is extremely important for the ranchers. So grass was mentioned all the time. Using these witness trees, you've got the distances from the section corners, quarter corners, and you can kind of help reconstruct stand structure. And there's terminology, specific terminology the surveyors used, and then more recently people have done mathematical analysis to try to figure out how well stocked stands actually were. They crossed streams and wetlands, and they also had cultural features. They had Native American village sites and things like that when they were there, trails, ranches, farm fields, fences, and this is all done starting around 1851, and for our particular area, up actually into about 1930, up on Mount Hood. That was the latest. Limitations were some of the archaic names of some of the species they used. We were able to decipher most of them. There's really only a handful of things that we still haven't figured out, like the skunk tree. A lot of these guys, these surveyors, were engineers. You know, they weren't botanists. And a lot of them came from the Midwest, so they may have brought concepts of plants from back there. The fraud and the bias did happen. A lot of these guys in Oregon, they think were very reliable, but California was well known for fraud in the surveys, and the guys would take their notes and make them in the tent or in the saloon or something, and and then they had to go back and resurvey with somebody else. Lack of species data can be a problem, particularly you're over on the east side in the, say, the sagebrush areas, and you just have very little information to go on other than sage or Great Basin wild rye. So and then sometimes you have the mapper bias. You have the bias of the surveyors themselves, and then you have the bias of people like me, the later year, using this stuff to map vegetation, and kind of looking at it through different lenses. But we tried to be loyal to what the surveyors were looking at and how they were reporting it. So if we look at these notes, you had the high political position of the chief surveyor, who's somebody, he was based in Oregon City, and then they'd move around. And when he would get appropriations from Congress, they'd hire out the deputy surveyors, which are basically contractors. And then they would hire a crew of chainmen and axemen, and there'd be usually about 4 to 6 people on a team. And they were incredibly tough characters. They worked around the year-round, all kinds of weather conditions, dragging these chains. And you can kind of get a view for the rough notes here. This column is the chaining, and there's 80 chains per mile. Everybody knows that. And so they have like 20 chains here, the top of ascent, and then they commence on a ridge, coursing east and west. And then at 30 chains, they go down again. So there's a lot up and down. And that, we often ignore that, except it's helpful for mapping purposes to if you have a landmark, you can record that. But at the veg, this would be the first mention of the veg. This is the quarter corner. And they had to record 2 witness trees for the quarter corner. And this happens to be Southern Oregon. So you've got a black oak and a ditto, another black oak. 10-inch diameter, 12-inch diameter. And tells you how many lengths away, 163 lengths and 120, or 111. And that's the kind of information you got. Then they cross some streams, then they go up and down again. And then at 80, section corner, the rules required they record 4 witness trees. So again, you've got black oak, here's a white oak. Actually, it looks like they only did 3 here. And if you see that, it's often a clue. And then to corroborate, you look at the chaining, and it's way up there, 137, 255 lengths, 219 lengths. And what you're in is a prairie. And I talked about the line description earlier, and here it is, this little description: land rolling prairie with a few scattering oaks on north half, soil second rate, gravelly loam. So there's clues scattered all through.
How long is a link?
A link, it was something like 3 inches. A chain was 66 feet long, if I remember my numbers right.
Were the witness trees in this case have to be in each quadrant?
Yes, each quadrant. Yep.
That's basically point-centered coordinate method.
Yes, exactly. And so when they got into the prairie, you'd have fewer trees because they're further apart. So if they were really conscientious, they'd walk that half a mile to the nearest oak. But a lot of times they just say, "Oh, the hell with it. There's enough. It's too far. It's beyond the limits, and won't record one." So this stuff, the great boon for working with this, we used to have to work with microfiche in these notes, and BLM went and digitized all of it. It's all on a website. It is just an amazing resource. So what we did, working off those handwritten notes, we transcribed the data into an Access database. And one was for the township. It's sort of a coarse scale. It just tells you which township, who did it, when they surveyed it. And then they were also required to write a general description of the whole township. And sometimes you'll get information in there that supplements what you're getting in the line data. And this is the line data, just what we looked at. It's got the line number that we've assigned to it, the direction the guys are going in, then their chaining, and what they're recording. And all the species here. And we've coded these so you can sort. Each of these codes tells you whether it's a stream, this is topography, this is corner data, and then this is description data. So it would be the stuff that's listed in here. You're talking about fir, pine, live oak, chinkapin, yew, and then they tell you, it's very thick. And so that's sort of supplemental. These species will be supplemental to what you're seeing in the witness tree data. Yeah.
I see references to soil types that are like
third rate, second rate? What are those?
That was pretty crude. It was, I haven't seen in the instructions actually specifically how, what that meant.
Okay.
But first rate obviously would be good farm, loamy soils.
So third rate, is that?
The third rate would be the worst. Maybe
Okay.
fourth even.
Okay.
Yeah, you get out in the alkali out there and the real rocky stuff. It might have been fourth rate.
But the criteria was agriculture. So
Yes.
it was always in reference. The bias was always in reference to. Could this be homesteaded, and if so, how well would it?
Yeah.
How productive would it be for agriculture?
And the topography notes, every time they hit a bottomland, they always recorded that because oftentimes that's the extent of the best soil before you hit the break. Yeah.
So if you were looking for cultural stuff, longhouse sites, things like that, where would you find that in that?
They mentioned it in this field here,
Okay.
the intercept field. And we don't have any here. In general, Western Oregon had almost nothing. And I think it's because the First Nations people had been killed off by disease or else removed to the reservations. There were very few reports. Down in southern Lane County into Douglas County, there were a few records of an Indian cabin, Indian Joe's cabin or something like that.
I would think in Columbia Gorge, though, you'd find some stuff.
There was very little. And it was surprising. And we got into Southwest Washington, there seemed to be a lot more. Even reference to cemetery locations and village sites. But for the Willamette, and I think the Rogue Valley, it was really
Do you
surprising.
think that's cultural bias, too?
It could have been, yes, it could have been. But the whole literature about the disease, the effects of the disease is, the area was depopulated as well. But like you said, they could have just ignored it. Another requirement, at the end of the survey, the surveyors had to draw what's called a plat map. And so it's showing all 36 sections. And then they had these crude descriptions of what's going on in here. And if you're lucky, they're really nicely detailed like this one. A lot of them were really schematic. And really, other than streams, they didn't show you much of anything. But some of them are really artistic. And this is a burn here, so showing little stumps all through there. And it just reminds me of something like an Elizabethan kind of map. Here we have a stream coming down, and you can see the detail that they've marked out the bottomland with. And it's marked, it's prairie, these little symbols, prairie here. And then you get a marshy area, a wet area. You have to remember that the most accurate description where these features are along the section lines. And the rest of the interior is more or less a sketch. So your data points are just along here. You'd have very accurate representation of where this stuff crossed the line. But out in the middle here, sometimes they have streams. If you compare them with topo maps now, they'll show a stream that goes over the top of the mountain and down the other side. But these are what we use to supplement the notes, and it's again the earliest kind of record for most of our area, in a visual map form. It's just a detail, again, what I talked about here. Different kind of a format. Here they show an outline of a prairie. And then somebody's cabin here, Mr. Pope. And a little wetland, a little marsh in there. And then the rest of that would all probably be forest. So we use these to synthesize and create the veg map. And we map it on Mylars and then use the standard 7.5-minute topo map as a base. So you've got survey notes, you've got the plat maps. If they hit a stream of a river or a big lake, they can't go through the middle of it, they go around along the edge. And so sometimes there's useful information in these meanders. They're going like this, and then they're random lines, and then they return to the main line. The donation land claims sometimes had useful information, mostly not. And then sometimes they'll tell you enter marsh, leave marsh along the section line, but you don't know how far the thing extended into the section. And so the modern NRCS soil maps often helped kind of fill in the blank on there. And LiDAR were used occasionally. I can't remember specific examples for that. This is another method of showing the edge of a prairie here. And then a settler has plowed up some fields in the prairie. And that was a very common practice. And it saved them from clearing trees. You know, might as well just use what's the openings that are already there. So to make a map, we had to figure out a veg classification. And again, it was based on what the surveyors were reporting and not modern standards of, you know, what the National Veg Classification or some other method might use. We were just following their descriptions and then kind of cobbling together they're not really plant communities, but they're just the groupings as they were reported by the settlers. I mean, they do have relationship to what we now call plant communities in the modern sense. There were 8 major classes, and then within each of these, depending again on species assemblages, we have numerous subclasses. So you could map it out in the GIS. You can map the coarse scale, class level, or you can map out the fine scale. And our major ones were forest, and we were able to split them into upland and riparian wetland. 2 kinds of forest. The woodland came as kind of a surprise, but it's kind of a no-brainer, you know, because it's intermediate between the forest and savanna. And the National Veg class actually does use woodland. The trees are spaced further apart than forest. The canopy, according to National Veg classification, canopy can just be touching. Whereas in the savanna, the trees are much farther apart, and the canopy's not overlapping. But of course, you can't tell, there's no information about canopy in the GLO notes. So you have to rely on of the other factors. And so for forest, first of all, they use these different descriptors in the quotes here. And then they use the chaining. So anything under 100 links or 66 feet, we put into forest. And usually all the bearing trees that are supposed to be there were recorded. And the woodland, you can see, had some different descriptors. The distances were greater. Most trees were in this section. I mean, the witness trees were there, but some of them weren't. And savanna, just again, further and further apart. And you start getting witness trees not being described, not being present. And another interesting one was the emphasis on grass. And once you get into savanna, it gives you a clue. The more emphasis they put on grass, you know that it's an open canopy. This was used, by the way, even in the Midwest, openings for savanna. It's just, I don't know where the term came from, but it's sort of a standard nomenclature for savanna in those days. And in the prairie, trees are even further apart or not there at all. Now, in Western Oregon and Washington, we've mapped these areas in gray here. And of course, there's oak through the valleys here. The area I was going to talk about is here on the east slope of the Mount Hood. And we did a little bit of mapping earlier this year on the Warm Springs. That's what the red are. And that's the Deschutes. And no oak mentioned for the Deschutes at all. Oak got down to about, I think it was this township on the Warm Springs. That was the furthest south that the GLO surveyors recorded it. So it's like 7 south, 11 east, I think, was the furthest south. And these were higher elevation. We were into the conifer forest there. So I don't think there was any oak reported. That's the top of the Deschutes forest. So the area that the Mount Hood wanted us to look at, we kind of wanted to make sure we got the whole townships. So we went into on the north side of the river a little bit. Mount Hood is here, and we're right at the edge of the Warm Springs down there. And if we look at major oak types in that mapping area on the Hood, we would define these by looking at the surveyor's notes. And first of all, in the witness trees, if there's a predominance of oak being used as a witness tree, that's a good indicator that you're in an oak-dominated veg type, or a combination of Doug fir oak. The other clue, oh, no, I can't. I'm not going to mention that one. You can see the combinations, forest, woodland, and savanna, and oak and ponderosa pine were the primary types, and just with a gradation of spacing. And if you look at the acreage figures here, you can see which was dominant. And the extent of the oak, so this would be the major types where the oak was either a witness tree or mentioned in that line description right up front. Minor types, you get a little bit of mention of oak in some of these transitional areas to the higher elevations. It might be a few oaks mentioned in there, not used as witness trees, but just in the line description. And of course, there's not going to be any oak really up high here. But even down here, there seemed to be not much recorded for that area. And if we look at the classes of the major oak types, the majority was a woodland type, that intermediate type. And again, it would have been oak and ponderosa. You do get into the forest, you're getting a little higher elevation, less of a rain shadow effect, with more moisture, lower temperatures, and it'd be more of a oak forest situation. And then the lowest and driest where the savanna is down here, and probably the most frequently burned. Just to give you an idea of the acreage of the different types. Again, the woodland was the predominant, and oak, ponderosa, and Doug fir combination were the dominant types for forest and woodland. And the savanna, the Doug fir dropped out. It was an oak ponderosa type. We had 135 witness trees that were oaks in the data set. And that was pretty good representation. And then the line descriptions were 123 mentions of oak as well. And you can find them occasionally. You're out there. Many times, what they had to do was blaze the tree. They'd cut it open with an axe. They had a scribe, and they'd scribe the township number onto the hardwood there. And then in many cases, the trees would heel over. And you'd look around for what they call cascades, scar like that. And sometimes they have to cut them open again to make sure that was a scribed tree. And unfortunately, sometimes they wouldn't heal over like that, and then you get hard rot. But you'd be looking, somewhere off of this away is the actual cap for the coroner. And this would be, 20 links or 50 links or however far it is.
Did they typically collect the diameter?
Yes, they did. So for that tree, that exact tree, when the first survey was done in 1882, it was 16 inches. And now you can see it's probably 28, 30, something like that.
Do you know where that tree was, by any chance?
That's at the top of the Weldon Wagon Road Trail. You come out right at the top, and you stumble right across it. And then the Washington DNR put this in later to replace the GLO corner. They started out with wooden stakes and rocks, scored rocks. And then later, starting around 1910, they started putting in the brass caps. And then they switched from GLO to BLM. So you're lucky if you find a GLO, an original GLO brass cap. Just for those people that are into that. So looking at witness trees, the majority of witness trees were 6 to 10 inch diameter. Now, does that represent the diameters that were out there during those years? Probably not. But you had to bring into account the instructions to the surveyors and to select trees that were going to be durable, to last long enough to serve as the witness to the coroners. So they probably picked some smaller, younger, more vigorous trees. Maybe with the hope that they, the scars would heal over and the trees going to be there for a while. If they picked these older age classes, the tree might burn out or fall down and just wouldn't last as long. So that's probably why. But again, some of these things you don't really know. But if you can get, by looking at a range of types along your section lines or within a little area, several section lines, and if you see an array of diameters, then you're pretty safe in assuming there was pretty good diversity of diameters there. So within that study area, the earliest surveys were like 1855, like I said, for Mount Hood, and some of the other higher elevation sites as late as 1930. But they captured most of the oak between 1860 and 1880. And again, that was probably because they were working these lower areas that had better potential for farming. If they had gone and done the surveys during this period, it might have been a really different story. There may have been a lot less oak because of the suppression of fire and invasion of conifers and that kind of thing. So it's a snapshot of time showing you how dominant it was at that particular moment. Well, this is just showing you a little bit different. It's pretty much the same profile, but the 1870s where they sampled it most intensely. And this is the website who I used to work for, INR, where the data are stored. If you want the GIS files, you can find them on here. And they're all downloadable. for the areas that we have mapped. And again, you know, if these methodologies would be helpful north of the river, it'd be worth a try. Any questions? Yeah.
What's the amount of effort for township to map using the notes?
Say that again?
What's the amount of time and effort to map at a township level, like one township, to do this?
Yes, it took, well, usually it would take like a few weeks to do an entire township.
Just you?
Oh, I'm sorry, me. I thought you meant these guys. No, you can, if you want to bust your butt, you can do it in a day. They're about anywhere from 600 to 1,200 records that you'll be putting into your database per township, which it makes, you know, you can do it in 6 or 8 hours. You'll be going cross-eyed by then. So it's good to kind of split it up. But that on average, 600 to 1,200 records, depending on what kind of topography and how much effort the surveyor put in. Some of them were kind of slapdash. Some of them recorded every log they stepped over. So we didn't record things like stepping over logs because it's just too much information. So, yeah.
Just over the last several weeks, my partner, Volcano Ridge Vineyard, and I have hired Tennyson Engineering to do a monumental survey of Volcano Ridge Vineyard. And one of the people working on it is Dan Bolt, who was the retired Wasco County surveyor. And I got a call on the cell phone about 2 weeks ago, and Dan was just beside himself with joy. He said he was looking for a section corner, and he found the witness tree, which was an oak about 12 inches in diameter that had burned and died. But he thought it was the witness tree based on his reconstruction of the direction and distance and so on. But he hadn't found the section corner. But it fit the description. It was dead. It was the right size. He then very carefully measured back the chain distance to the section corner and thought there was nothing there. He dug down, dug around. And then the duff and everything else found a basalt cobble with a.
Oh, wow.
On the section corner in 1859.
Wow.
He was really excited. It was all that just because of the historic aspect.
That's neat. Now, if the BLM had done that, they probably would have brought the stone back up to the surface, and they probably would have put a brass cap in.
Right, but it had been lost.
Yeah, if it was private land especially, well, the county surveyors don't always go back and find these things. Yeah.
Your translation of these surveys that you gave an example of where you wrote things out. Now, do you have that, if I went to that website, would I find that for, for instance, the Rivers, the Dalles, Wasco County here? Because I have to ask, I've been admiring your work for years. And I tried going to the survey records that the BLM has, you know, it's written out. I couldn't understand it. Terminology. I didn't know what a chain was, as a matter of fact. And also some of their other terms. I really tried hard. But and I figured a little out, but I just, if you have the translations available, that would be great.
They're not online. So it's always been, if you request it, we can send you a copy.
What would we request? Because
Send it to me. Yeah,
John, if you want to send it to me, I can send it out to the partners. And they can,
my email.
yeah.
Okay.
Or just the information, and I can distribute it.
Well, usually I need to know what area you want, and then I can query the database. But it's going to be the same. It's going to be the same lingo as what you're seeing in those notes primarily. It'll be it'll be a little better. What the thing we haven't done, and I need to campaign for some money. ideally, we want to get all the data in those databases and turn it into a geodatabase, because in GIS, because all we have now are the veg polygons. But theoretically, you could take any of those points that they're recording along the line, and you could have those digital and see what the record stands for. So you could have cultural features, you know, streams, and the geodatabase has a lot more utility that way. But we just had this protocol set up years before they had the geodatabases, and we never got around to doing it. But again, if you don't have GIS on your computer at home, it's hard to interpret it. So the printout, if you don't have a GIS, the printout is going to be much handier. So, yeah.
So I wonder if you've ever come across this. I've been working with one surveyor. Yeah, this is down in California though, and it's only one surveyor I've seen do this. But his plat maps, each section line has a symbol or sometimes more than one symbol, and they look. I think they're the planetary symbols that are used in like astrology.
No, haven't seen that.
It's the only survey I've seen who did it, but he did it consistently on all of his plat maps. And I've asked around to see if it's has something to do with what a surveyor would use for maybe shooting planets when they're taking.
Well, they had to calibrate their transits, and sometimes they had to do it every day. They get up before dawn and look at the North Star. But it doesn't seem to me to warrant.
He was very consistent about it. Each
Yeah.
section had this what appears to be a
But-
planetary symbol.
But it was on the plat and not in the notes.
Not in the notes, it's on the plat.
Yeah, no, I've never heard of that. They did get ingenious. They made rubber stamps when they got out into the sagebrush because everything was so repetitive. And the technology evolved. This would have been like 1910 maybe. They started using rubber stamps just because all their corners were rocks and everything was the same. So, yes.
So John, if I've seen the maps correct, the part that's been remapped by you is just the National Forest boundary westward? East of the National
Well,
Forest?
for the Mount Hood project we did, it was defined by townships. But so some of it went outside the boundary a little bit, but we tried to just do entire townships. The one for the Deschutes followed more the forest boundary. Yeah, just depends how much money there was. So that one was tight. So. Or generally, not even the boundary. I try to at least do the section, the whole sections. So if the section goes over the boundary, I'll go out and do that. But doing the whole township was beyond our means on that one. So, yeah.
I just wanted to mention, if you really geek out on this stuff, there's a book called Cheney, Oregon.
Yes.
I can't remember the author's name, but it's stories about surveyors and how they survived their jobs and all the behind what they were doing at the time.
We refer to it here on the website.
It's a little dry.
That's right.
But it's interesting too.
Yeah, some of them are out on the line, and the line, part of the line was on fire, so they had to move fast. And another one during the Rogue Indian Wars, they had to suspend some of their surveys because there was hostilities nearby, and they had to clear out in a hurry. Then they'd go back. So yeah, we had some books referenced on one of these pages on this website too. And there's Chaining Oregon was probably the best. There's one for British Columbia, and then we had some of the BLM publications as well. If you really want to geek out, the BLM had one called the Rectangular Survey System. It's that thick, but it's a cool read. Yeah.
So was there conventionalized, when they make the fat maps, because I've not figured out how you got all the information you did out of those. Was there anything standardized about how they were supposed to depict a wetland and how they were supposed to depict a prairie?
There must have been.
Symbols, because, or did, I got told that each surveyor kind of had made up their own symbols.
Well, I haven't seen all the sets of instructions, but that fat book I was talking about has several of the editions of the instructions. And they tell you how to set corners, but there weren't any instructions on how to depict the different features. But there somewhere, sometime, there must have been something to try to standardize it. I mean, that little wetland thing, you know, with the grass, tussocks of grass, I mean, it seemed to be pretty universal. So, and the squiggly lines, but the other ones were just, they would paint these blobs. So it may have been up to the guys, they were usually clerks who copied all this stuff. They had to make 3 copies of the survey notes. And that was usually done once the deputy surveyor handed his stuff in. And then they had the clerks would copy it all and also redo the maps. And sometimes you'll see the plat maps were redrafted by WPA people in the 1930s. And maybe they lost some of the detail when they did that. Because like I said, some of them are more schematic than others. So I'm not sure what always went on. But anyway, it's interesting, and Oak was well represented, and
Thank you.
I hope that helps.
That was wonderful.
Okay.
All right, Tanner, can I just, how do I get into this again? Yeah. Ah.